Hello, Yves.
Hello, Andrew.
Thank you so much for being willing to talk to us about this amazingly complex and interesting and worrying subject.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
So, of course, we're talking about the Ukraine war and the enormous ramifications. Start off with, how's the war going now in your understanding?
So, phase one of the war, after February 24th, was a disaster for Russia. So they had a plan to take Kyiv in 48 hours and decapitate the president and replace him as an oligarch. And then they would have put Europe, the West, in trouble, because then there would be a country there with a new government that would forbid any intervention or any weapons, whatever. So it would be a whole issue. That miserably failed for two main reasons. First, because Russia was not well organized. They had hubris there. They thought it would be like a picnic, like in Crimea in 2014, but it wasn't at all. So there was not even a unified command. Everything was done by Putin, and there were 6 different armies from different parts of Ukraine. And then they had poor equipment, poor strategy. On the other hand, Ukraine was ready, partly helped by all the information that the US had released. And so they did strategic defense and they pulled back. They abandoned the frontiers. They all protected Kyiv instead and a key airport. And then they were ready with ambushes in the forest with all those anti-tank missiles. And because the Russians were not thoughtful about it, they came with column of tanks that were just ready for the picking. And so this whole thing collapsed very early, within the first 4 days. Then they had to move to plan B, which was eventually concede that defeat, pull back, and try to focus on the east, the Donbass, and the south. On the south, they want a corridor between Crimea and the rest of Russia. And then on the east, they want to finish taking over the Donbass. So we are in that war now. Initially, they tried to move very fast with a pincer strategy, which has failed. Again, because of very strong resistance by Ukraine. Ukraine also has 1 million men on the arms now, because they have done general mobilization of all men. Russia hasn't done mobilization, so they have 50% of the entire army in eastern Ukraine, and they don't have much to fall back on, right? So many, there were huge casualties in the first 3 weeks, about 12,000 dead Russian soldiers.
Which is about 30% of their force, something like that?
Yeah.
Incredible,
And then 4 times more casualties. So if you take all the casualties, that's... and that was the first 3 weeks. So by now, we're probably 20 to 30,000 dead soldiers, much more than the whole Afghanistan war for them. And so right now, they have switched to... They don't do mobilization because there would be too much of a loss of face for Putin. And so they're moving to an artillery war, which is almost a ground war, with long-distance artillery and drones to do reconnaissance. So it's mostly drones and artillery. Yes, the last 2 days, they moved a little bit, maybe a kilometer forward. But meanwhile, the Ukrainians pushed back in the north on Kharkiv. So they essentially liberated Kharkiv and pushed back all the guns beyond the city as well. So now we're looking at a stalemate kind of situation. They have, of course, finished off Mariupol. So they got the land bridge. They got Kherson and they got Mariupol. So the southern land bridge is captured, even though, if it was for the long term, there would be guerrilla, there would be opposition. It's not easy to hold either. Meanwhile, Ukraine is getting a lot of weapons in. The US just passed a $40 billion allowance, which is huge, right? And the US is about to send anti-ship missiles as well. So there's a lot of potential escalation there, but so it's not going very well for Russia, right, at this point.
The losses that they've taken so far are so remarkable that you wonder, is it possible that Russia's army could actually basically grind to a halt and they be forced to say, okay, we'll really negotiate?
Well, so for negotiations to happen, you need both sides to be ready. At this point, for sure, Ukraine is not in the mood because since they have a lot of momentum and they keep liberating areas like, north of Kyiv, north of Kharkiv, So they may still think they have a chance to push back. Because once you get into peace talks, we know what Russia wants, right? They won't let go any territory in the east and the south. They want to hold on to them, and they want some kind of neutrality. And so for Ukraine, having suffered that much and given so much, to concede those is a huge pain, right? So Ukraine would not be ready at this point. And meanwhile, Russia still thinks they can finish off the Donbass. They almost finished with Luhansk, but Donetsk, they only have about half of it. So both think that they can do more. And it takes both to be exhausted, and then to be ready to take some compromise.
So we may well be a month or more away from that point.
But there's a range of analysis among military experts, but some say many months into 2023 even, because we have a trench warfare and artillery, and there's so much at stake for Putin personally, because that's his personal mistakes, his biggest mistake ever. He has always won all his bets before. He's not ready to concede at all. So the other thing is, it's not a war. It's a very unusual war. It's not a war about resources, about oil or even agriculture or anything, or a war about pure power. It's a war about identities, and it's the effort of Putin to basically undo 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And because for Putin, the borders of Russia in 1991 went back all the way to 1600. And so all the Tsars he admires, especially Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, all their gains have been lost.
Yes.
And Catherine the Great is the one who built Odessa, which became the big port of Russia on the Black Sea. And of course, she took Crimea from the Ottomans. And so that's pretty much in his idea. It's like Russia cannot be this mega power of Asia and Europe without grabbing a big chunk of Ukraine.
So it's essentially a romantic idea, not a pragmatic thing that's going on here.
That's right. Yeah, the experts like Fiona Hills, who is a national security advisor on Eastern Europe and Russia for Obama, what she says is it's remarkable that Putin has been extremely isolated during COVID, but in general over the last few years, he has spent a lot of time reading Russian history. He spent a lot of his days reading, and he has certain tsars that he admires. He has their statues around him, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, and there's two more. And so he has a deep sense, very romantic sense. Well, we call them identity fights, and identity fights are the ones to death, right? They're the most dangerous ones. Meanwhile, Ukraine there has been this effort to free themselves from the Russian yoke since, for 300 years. They got a little chance in 1917 for a year. They immediately declared independence when Russia was defeated. They had a Rada, parliament, later forced back by the Soviets, and then Stalin then tried to force them into obedience with the Holodomor, with this huge famine that was engineered. So it's been going on for a long time, that fight. Ukraine wants the right to be, and Russia wants to be this mega European power with these romantic ideas.
And it can't be a mega European power without the 52 million people of Ukraine, its location and its resources. But without that, I think you said it's essentially an Asian empire.
That's right. That's also the argument that Zbigniew Brzezinski was making, former national security advisor of Carter, one of the most respected strategic analysts in the US. And he said, it defines the identity of Russia, whether they have Ukraine or some dominance of Ukraine or not.
It's huge. Also, the Ukraine has much reason to hate Russia from, as you said, the starvation engineered by Stalin between the wars. And perhaps, just thinking about these fascist elements that in Ukraine, you can see that anybody that will defeat our greatest enemy, you can see some attraction to it. So, anyway.
Right, so here there's an interesting story. So initially, Ukraine was dominated by the Swedish Empire. the Great Swedish Empire, which also dominated part of Russia. And then they asked for help from the Russian Cossacks to free themselves. And that was back in 1700. But then the Russians then said, "Oh, now we're staying," and so they got then under this domination, and under the Tsars, the Ukrainians were seen as second class, so there has been this huge resistance on this effort to exist. But in 1917, when they had that short independence, it was under German protection and tutelage. So they saw the German side as a potential guarantor for the independence. So when then in 1941, when Hitler invaded, the nationalists under Stephen Bender, the Ukrainian nationalists, then joined rank with Germany, thinking that that's the ticket to have independence.
Yeah, we've got a big devil, and we've got a devil that isn't as devilish to us. Let's go with the devil that is less devilish to us.
And by the way, the Azov battalion in Mariupol, in that big factory, formed in 2014, is following Stephen Bandera. That's their idol, etc. And that's why Putin calls them Nazis. And they did use, even in 2014, they used Nazi symbols,
yes,
swastika and all this. So that's the origin. Since then, they got then incorporated in the army, and then they got expanded with other. But yeah, for Ukraine, it's more out of desperation. At the time, that's the only way that you find to have a chance to exist.
How is this going to? What's the end game in all this? I mean, obviously, there's many end games. So, what options do you see for winding this up?
Right. So essentially, there is three types of scenarios. One scenario would be a full Ukraine victory. Ukraine manages to push back Russia to the border, and then there is a very cold peace, with an armed frontier and a very weird position for Russia in the global system, like a very aggrieved Russia, like Germany after World War I. So this is one problem. A second scenario is a long grinding stalemate, trench warfare. They exhaust each other. They keep bombing each other. There is dangers of escalation here and there. For example, when Ukraine, sinks a major ship and it's with American help, or all kinds of situations that are risky. And of course, meanwhile, Russia could send more bombs on Lviv in the west and all this. But that's the stalemate, and it could be months, right, before they settle. A third would be if Russia feels that they're in danger, they really can't, or at least as defined by Putin, because Putin, it calls all the shots. If Putin feels his existence or his power or the existence of Russia is at stake, then there is a doctrine in the Russian doctrine, military doctrine, that they can escalate to de-escalate. And that means using tactical nuclear weapons or even strategic nuclear weapons. And in fact, so Graham Allison has done, the famous professor at Harvard, who is the expert on Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear issues. He said recently that he had been doing simulations with Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan and other top military commanders about what would happen, right? So if Russia does a tactical nuclear strike on a 20,000 people city, and then threatens if you don't give up, next is Kyiv, then what do we do, right? What's the reaction? And he said after they went through all the scenarios, there was absolutely no good option. It was horrible or more horrible. And he said in the end, it would be extremely difficult to use a nuclear response, because then you can't stop the escalation all the way to the end.
So in other words, Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon and there'd be no nuclear response.
Right, because any response would go up. That is a famous ladder, 40 steps. But when you pass ladder 18 or 20, you have no more switch, right? You keep escalating, almost logically. And so that's not possible, or at least at least someone like Biden would not want to do this. You never know about a future president, right? But, and so then the options are poor. So in that sense, Russia has that option. And that's the scary part. So we have to do everything to prevent it. And the best prevention of that there are two parts to preventing the use of nuclear weapons. The first one is to almost ensure that Ukraine doesn't get a total victory, because then you lose face too much for Putin.
Don't make them desperate.
Right. And the other part of the story is China. As far as we know, China has told Putin that this is an absolute red line to use nuclear weapon. And in fact, Xi Jinping made a speech 2 weeks ago saying enough is enough, the war has gone too long, it's creating chaos everywhere. We didn't never name Russia, right? But that was a pretty strongly worded speech. And I've heard from top Europeans who spoke with the Chinese delegation, with Xi Jinping, that they had an understanding that China cannot tolerate nuclear weapon use. But that's what we are relying on, right? There's high risk.
Because we're in a very high risk world. Based on those books you showed me earlier, we've been in a high risk world all along.
Right. So the story I was mentioning is this one.
Yeah.
1983, we had not once, but twice, and in fact, 2.5, between September and November, an almost nuclear war between US and Soviet Union. Yeah. The first one in late September, there was a false alert on the Russian computer system showing that the Americans had launched all their missiles and they were coming in waves. And so we were like seconds from launching the retaliation. But the head of the center that day overrode all the normal procedures because he was a computer scientist. He was replacing the normal guy who was sick. And he knew the computer system had just been changed and could have had a bug.
Wow.
That's September. And then November, the Americans launched a major military exercise of the whole of NATO that involved nuclear weapons in real time with Pershing and cruise missiles and involved heads of states, including Kohl and Thatcher and Mitterrand and Reagan personally. So on the other side, under the Soviets, the leader was Andropov, who was the former KGB head, and as he's kind of known to be paranoid, a bit like Putin, and he had done simulations since 1980 in the KGB, showing that there was a good chance the Americans would do a first decapitation strike at some point, and so they had a whole procedure how to respond. And when he saw that, he thought this was it, so he triggered maximum alert. Now we are alert 1 or 2 out of 5 under Putin, but he launched the alert number 5,
which is the hair trigger stage.
Right, and every submarine left ports. All aircraft, departed and were in the sky. Everything was on maximum alert, and then the Americans. So the hero there was the Air Force commander in NATO, who is American, who picked up all this and conveyed to the Americans to absolutely not do the same, to stand down on the nuclear and then call off the exercise, which they did. But it shows how misunderstandings, as interpreted by the other side, can destroy us. And we were that close, yeah.
As you said in your talk earlier, that the effect on global markets is food and fertilizer and energy. And it's having a profound effect on all the countries of the world, isn't it?
Right. So those are the two direct channels, but there's some bigger channels as well. So the most direct is first on food. There is a blockade by Russia of all the ports of Ukraine, and Russia, and there's an embargo on Russia. So Ukraine plus Russia together were 25% of wheat export, and a lot of them, for example, Egypt was almost 100% reliant on both, especially Ukraine. So there's a bunch of countries that are more reliant, more dependent, and directly hit. But in general, if you take out 25% of the market, there's a huge spike. There's also huge tension on canola. And by the way, that's why China just removed the embargo on Canadian canola. And it's not because they're nice to Canada, it's because there's no other canola anywhere. So everyone is planting canola, like in the countryside in France where I was in April. Normally there is other stuff, there is buckwheat, everything is becoming canola. So that there is those products like that, and fertilizers, a lot of it done by Ukraine. So we have a huge pinch. Then on energy, it's even bigger because it's caused by the embargo from the West. So it's not so much Ukraine, it's Russia there. Russia is essentially an economy that's almost entirely reliant on energy. And so we are trying, the whole West now is trying to do an embargo on oil to start with. And they are, either the first or second exporter of oil in the market based on at least producer, exporter usually after Saudi Arabia, but they are huge. And we're trying not to prevent a reshuffling of the market. So we're trying, and Europe's trying to do it by December, because Europe takes 40% ish, actually half, 50% of all oil, $180 billion a year goes to Europe. And so right now, still during this war, Europe is paying $1 billion a day to Russia because of oil and then to some extent gas. So they're trying to not only stop anything by December, which is very big for some countries, very, very hard to do, but also to then do secondary sanctions on every other country in the world to try to avoid having that oil go elsewhere. We are not there yet, but it's provoking a spike in the markets on oil, and everything else then follows. There's also a bit of coal, and so that's just immediate effects. Then there's two larger effects. The next effect is the fact that the West has done something never tried before, which is generalized sanctions on banks, the whole banking system, but also on the central bank to freeze $600 billion of reserve. Nobody has thought it was possible, and nobody has tried to do this. And so the lesson from that is for many countries, starting with China, that means your reserve, your $3 trillion are not safe. That means the whole plug you have into globalization is not safe. So an artillery ready to use against you. So the trust in global finance and global central banks and all this and globalization is in danger, except for the West. But the West is now less than 50% of the world economy. It's 45-ish. 20 years ago, it was 65, but the West has shrunk by 20 points, right?
But is the West a larger portion of the control of finance?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Except that, in terms of reserves and in terms of trade and all this and all the flows, then there the West is again in the 45 range, where it used to be 2/3.
So the impacts are, first of all, directly.
Yeah.
Reducing the supply of food and oil, and thus jacking up the price. And secondly, by the financial measures the West has taken, weakening dramatically the faith of other players in the integrity of the global system for trading.
Right. So because the whole idea of globalization, or the Fukuyama idea, it's the advance of democracy and markets, free markets everywhere, was based on trust, that markets are disconnected from security. We also assumed that there was interdependence that would create peace anyway. But the effort here to extract from the world economy Russia, which is 1.7% of global GDP, has shocked everyone else, at least in the global south, even India, for example, who is an ally of the West, but still shocked by that process. And so it's bringing home to all of them that there is no such thing as a non-political globalization, that markets are connected to security and to politics. And that's the first time we have this reckoning since the 1980s almost, at least 1990.
And there must be a feeling amongst countries like India, as well as China, that we aren't calling the shots, that it'll just be done to us if we...
Right.
Yeah.
Now, of course, China is 19% of global GDP, not 1.7. And 130 countries around the world has China as their first market. And it's 12% of EU export go to China, 11 of American, only 5 for Canada. But it's not at all like Russia. Russia is a midget, except for energy. But the thought, there's a lot of excitement in the West that we can do this to China sooner or later, not thinking that, as far as I can see from the numbers, doing this to China would also destroy our economies.
Yes.
And there's for example, Japan is 27% of export to China. Korea is 30, Taiwan is 45. If we decouple China from globalization, those economies are toast, right? They'll be in deep recession and there'll be unrest and everything. But all this is questioned. There's complete volatility about the global system right now.
So it's been one of the huge advances. I mean, speaking as a layman, it's gone from where you have to have gold and have to have physical wealth to having money in the bank, having credit, right? And that's now under threat, isn't it? Because now it's like you've got money in the bank until we say you don't, right? And that's and that obviously destroys people's faith. So that's the knife at the throat of globalization. Then.
And so here, so far, we've talked about global south, but deep down, Europe doesn't feel safe either, because Donald Trump used such methods. And in particular, and then Americans have used a lot of arrest of American executives to force Europeans to apply American sanctions on Iran that were not UN sanctions or European sanctions. So there's a lot of Europeans who think now we're aligned with Biden, but in 2024, if Trump is back, all bets are off because, they have put their finger in a cookie jar, right? So, and in the end, all this is American control, not European control, right? The whole financial system is New York, right?
so the Europeans are probably looking at saying we need to protect ourselves from this sort of global policing.
At least some of them were talking that way. And there was discussion about all this in 2019. They were worried about trade. So there was talk of WTO -1, minus US, or -2, depending on China. There was discussion of G20 -1, -2. In fact, the G20 did a lot of 19+1 statements because US would go with nothing. No discussion on trade, SDG or climate were allowed by Trump, right? And that's the essence of the G20. So Europeans have not forgotten. Under Biden, there's complete alignment and there's a clear villain here with Russia. Having done the most horrible thing, complete invasion of another country. It's blatant, it's criminal, and they do it even poorly at that. So everyone is lined up, but everyone is also having second thought. It's like, what does it mean about this? So we have a bit of a castle of cards. This whole globalization or interdependence was built on trust, also American leadership, and is built on the belief that America, which controls the system deep down, will not, misuse it, or will not use it as a rogue nation. Yes. But there is a bit of doubt.
There's a lot of African countries and some countries around the world, in the South especially, who are abstaining from UN resolutions and are disaffected with the West. I had the word sanctimony and hypocrisy about the West's actions in Libya and Iraq. So maybe could you talk a bit about the Global South?
Yeah, so there have been a series of votes. So the key indicators are indeed those votes at the UN General Assembly, also one in the UN Security Council at the beginning. So there were the first two votes, late March, early April, condemning Russian action. Here, it did pass UN Security Council. China did not veto, just abstain. But the first shock late March was that India abstained too, along with China. And so that was a big surprise. Then in the UNGA, there were 35 abstentions, including India and China. And then we moved forward to April 7, and this was a real significant vote. It was the vote to take out Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. It's kind of basic. There's a Human Rights Council, and of course, how could you have such a human rights violator, in the council? But it passed, so Russia is out, suspended, not fully out. By 95 countries voted for out of 192, right? But there were many more abstentions. There were 55 abstentions. And when you look at them, every major country in the G20 outside the West voted to abstain. Every major democracy outside the West, except the Philippines and Turkey. Turkey, it's not a democracy anymore, but Philippines not G20, Turkey and G20, they went along and they voted to boot out Russia. But, take Brazil, India, South Africa, countries that we count on, right? That are 80% of the world population. They all abstain. Mm-hmm.
Argentina, as an example?
Yeah, abstain, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand the psychology of Argentina, just as an example of one of these many abstentions.
Peru and Ecuador voted with. So in Latin America, there are those. Mexico, from what I remember, abstained. That's another surprise, right? And the reason why, so Exhibit A really here is India, because India is the member of the Quad, right? Is the bulwark that the US want to use.
Just define the Quad for a moment.
So the Quad is the group of 4 nations, US, Japan, Australia, and India. That's the sort of new proto-NATO of Asia, or the proto-alliance that the US is building to push back against China in Asia. So it's a fundamental grouping. It's the biggest pillar of the Biden foreign policy. And then, so first everybody realizes, oh my, India has abstained in the UN Security Council, UNGA. But now when you listen to a lot of Indian voices, for example, the former National Security Advisor of the previous government, Menon, who was the architect of the warming up between US and India, including the nuclear deal under Bush Jr., he is pretty critical. He said, well, first of all, 80% of our military equipment comes from Russia, so we can't alienate them. That's the driver. But we also don't like the hypocrisy in the West, he says. First of all, to call it democracy versus autocracy is wrong, he says, because if you start doing this and talk about values, we're going to ask you about Iraq, 2003, we're going to ask you about Kosovo, Libya, etc., and colonization. So he said, let's not get into values, because then we have to explain how democracy colonized others, right? And you say it's basically bullshit, right? What it is it's national interest. And there's this existential clash, between Russia and Ukraine that would happen no matter what the governments are. But also the US pretends to act for values, but in fact follow its own power dynamic itself, right? So let's be real here. Let's talk about power and interest. Then we could talk about our interest. You talk about your interest. There's no need for hypocrisy. And India is, again, the primary ally. It's a democracy, primary ally of the US in Asia. So that's why it's an Exhibit A, right? It calls you... they also against any boycott of international organization, kicking out Russia. They say, well, it's, you've done bad thing, we didn't kick you out. So, it's kind of, why do you call the shots anyway? We're in a more equal world right now, with the West is less than 50% of global GDP and 20% of world population, actually 12%, depending what you count. And so that world is over. We want a post-colonial world. And that's your main ally, right? Talking to you. Indonesia, democracy, also abstain in that final vote on April 7, G20 chair, but very close to the West, still speaks along the same lines without Russian military dependence, right? But they say we need a world where we accept the post-colonial realities, where the West cannot call all the shots.
So these abstentions, say Mexico, for instance, take one of them, you would say that wasn't value-based, it was realpolitik-based. So
for some, abstention by Vietnam, by the way, has been courted by the US for 20 years, right? Also abstained. And in fact, in one vote, voted negative even. So for Vietnam or India or even Sri Lanka, those all have military relationship with Russia. Mali, there's a few in Africa like this. Mali now is full of Russian mercenaries, and they've kicked out the French, right? Central African Republic, Russian mercenaries. So there's Group A, where there's military dependence on Russia. Then there's Group B, who don't have military dependence on Russia, but they act more in a post-colonial sense. That Modi was sanctioned personally by the US. It's like, I was sanctioned that was post-colonial. I don't accept sanctions on other either. So it's something more. We want to create a new world order where the global South and the global North are equal. We're partners now. You can't bully us anymore. even though we are on your side with democracies, but it's a post-colonial world. So that's what's there, right?
Mm. The evolution of the world has got to the point where nations are more equal and can't be pushed around. Because I know that the institutions that were set up after the Second World War, the World Bank as well as the United Nations, heavily dominated by the US. I gathered that any time that historically when one power rises, that was when the power sequence changes, that it's a very disruptive time, isn't it?
Right.
So maybe this is the trigger for people saying, okay, now is the time that we're fed up with the way things are, and things have got to change from now on.
Yeah, so we call this an interregnum. This is a period of competition because indeed there has been power shift. So the real thing is the West, so US plus its allies, were, from the 50s to 2000, were 65 to 70% global GDP and 80%, well, the Soviet 70% military power, yeah, you could say. So preponderant power. Between 2000 and 2016, 17, on the GDP side, it went from 65 to 45. So actually we shifted 21%.
Wow.
And so the reason why the head of World Bank is always American, the head of IMF is always European, is because they were they had a deal between each other, and they had together 2/3 of GDP, so they had 2/3 of the votes. There's a lag between votes and GDP, but nowadays, the global south is like, no, you can't just keep doing this. No, we need to have a say. So that's one fundamental thing. But the other thing is, global institutions and global order is actually not a natural thing. It's a very difficult thing because the world we live in is what we call a Westphalian world, where all power lies with sovereign states. That's the legacy of Westphalia, 1600. It was a European compromise, 1644, but then they spread that compromise worldwide through colonization and then independence. And so, in principle, no global institution has power. And the reason why we had something called the global order is because the US had hegemony, had overwhelming power, and also was enlightened enough to create an order that was not just power-based, but also partly rule-based. They created a bit of a constitutional order, and they created institutions, and they tended to respect the rules most of the time, except for the 70 coup they did. They did 70 coups between 1950 and 2000. One after the other, Grenada invasion, etc. But that was the payment to the US for being the police and for being the benign hegemon, because historically hegemons are never benign, since they have overwhelming power.
So the values argument is regarded by non-American players as just a covering for the behavior of the United States, which is just power-based, power interest behavior.
Well, it was hybrid, right? So to the US credit, they did create global institutions, like WTO, IMF, that sometimes had good functional usefulness for the public good. The UN was initially idealist, and they respected many rules. They accepted WTO rulings for a long time. And so it's a hybrid. They took exception. At least the Monroe Doctrine was still present. So most of the coups are in the Americas. By the way, that's why Ukraine says you're hypocritical, because if there was, that's where the US did coup after coup after coup, especially Salvador Allende in Chile or whatever. We're just doing the same in Ukraine, right? You would do that the same, don't you? Yeah.
You said the Ukraine. I mean, the Russians. Russians are saying that we're just doing what you did in Chile.
Right. That's right. Except it didn't kill as many. Well, still it killed a lot of people, and with American support. Yeah. At the end. And torture and all this, right? And disappearance, 20,000 dead, etc. And one after the other in South America. So, but in many other dimensions, the US did maintain a functioning global economic order that allowed the world to go richer and allowed China to develop after 1990, especially The first 10 years were more internal, but after 90, they opened up to globalization. Same with India, same. So they enabled the rest of the world to catch up and to, so that's the benign part. But however, this, for the US, the part of the bargain rely on getting more goodies than others, had to serve the US interest, and having dominant power. Today, there's a lot of people in the US who feel that they don't get their share, in large part because of domestic problems, right? The policy-making system in the US rewards winners and punishes losers, so they don't spread the benefits of globalization, so all the losers are mad. And then also now the margin of action of the US has shrunk, right? They can't boss China, they can't boss India, they can't even boss Brazil. So it's a different world where the power is more spread. And then the rising power, China, start to try to create its own rules. So they accept a whole bunch and they refuse some, and they're trying to push their advantage. And so in Interregnum, the major powers are struggling for rule setting. That's the book I'm writing now. Competition, innovation, and disruption in the global order. And in history, in many cases, it ended very badly with a world war, because typically the declining hegemon doesn't want to concede and doesn't want to facilitate the rise of the new one. The new one thinks, no, we have accepted, for 30 years we've been quiet. Now we have equal power. We need to have equal say. And the other one said, never, you will never get equal say. And then, so traditionally, those tensions become enormous. And so the challenge for humanity, because we have too many weapons now, that we could destroy the whole planet easily, we need to find an alternative to diffuse that hegemonic transition and the multipolar dimension as well, with new ways that, and the new way we invented since 1919, since Wilson, since 1945, was global institutions and global norms and international law. But it came all the way to Donald Trump, who then said, no, I don't accept global institutions, global norms, global laws. And so that was the shock for everyone in international relations, because that's all we got, right? If we want to go back to just power, then we know we will have struggles and wars. So we need to have something else.
So the global order favored the US massively, but it was a net benefit, and it did a lot of good, I'd say.
Right.
And now it's under
with some bad. There's some countries and some people who were on the wrong end of the stick. And it's hard to give the percentage, but it could be 25%. But the majority, 75%, benefited.
Do you think populism is something that's going to wash away, or is it going to become a larger and larger impact in the world?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue. First of all, the worst of populism will be 2024, right? So the one that matters is the US, because the US holds the key to the world right now. They have half the weapons of the world, right? So if the US goes rogue, then the whole world goes crazy. Whereas Canada, they can go populist and rogue, it won't matter very much for the rest of the world, right? It won't matter just for Canadians. And so, yes, it's coming, and it looks like it's going to be a very good shot for Trump and the Trumpist Republicans in 2024. And then it will be a lot worse than what I've seen before. A lot of destruction and a lot of drastic actions.
So a lack of interest in global institutions and global rules.
Yes. So in fact, all populists are against global rules and global institutions, and especially Trump. And the horrible part of it is that this is the best invention humanity has come up with to avoid, the destructive wars of the past. All this comes down to human nature. And that's the link to my interest in mindfulness and cognitive science. I'm writing more and more with cognitive models and neuroscience. What we discover is that humans are able to, the mind is not very stable. The brain is not stable, has imperfections. And we always are primed to be anxious and to run away from danger, to see danger even worse than what it is, right? And that's legacy from our past as Homo sapiens in the forest where we have to run from, always look for food and run from animals. Then we're small bands and we're vulnerable. So now we're in a very, very different stage, but the brain is the same. And so we look for comfort, and we worry very, very fast. And then we're social, and we need, basically we're motivated never by pragmatism, but by stories, by narratives. There's a lot of new research showing that what really motivates a society to come together is a narrative or an imagination or a story. And then, meanwhile, there's a few extreme of us who become the leaders, who are entrepreneurial and want power. They're always able to craft a narrative and a story that will get a lot of people. And themselves, they discount the risks and the cost, and they maximize the benefit of power. They have usually, we know for Trump that he's narcissistic. He has a bunch of, psychological features that make him search for that power and that dominance, no matter what the cost. He discounts the cost for the other people. But he's a wonderful narrative maker and storyteller. And so he's able to capture a lot of people. So that's the danger we face is, can we as human progress sufficiently in our handling of our anxiety and in our following false narratives, especially in the era of social media, before we destroy the world, right? Because humans have not evolved in terms of that psychological dimension, but now we have the tools of the god, right? So we have weapons, we're about to have AI, we're about to have crazy stuff. But we have archaic brains that are always anxious and looking for protection, afraid of the other side. And then we make up stories about the other. We're so poor at understanding people in other places, in other situations. So I call this the internet paradox. I'm writing a book on 12 paradoxes of human governance now. But one is the internet paradox is we have more information than ever, and yet the misunderstandings and the bubble isolation between, say, Chinese and Americans, or Canadians and Chinese, or Canadian or Japanese and Chinese, or all around the world, is growing. The more information I have, the more it's growing, because we only pick the information that we like, and the algorithms give us what we like. So we're not exposed to diversity.
So you have some hope that the mindfulness movement, which is everywhere, I mean, this really is percolating through our society and no doubt other societies around the world. You think that's got a hope of arresting that trend?
Well, this is a key clue and a key component, and some of the best peacemakers, some of the best leaders that have led to global institutions, etc., they always also had an internal side that was rooted in some sort of mindfulness. There's all kinds of traditions feeding into this. But it's likely that no leader with the ability to stop destructive war will do it without some kind of bigger picture in the mind, right? And so that bigger picture comes from a certain detachment, from an ability to think big picture, to think altruistically in an empathetic way about a larger universe than just oneself, right? And so I think it's a requirement, but it's not sufficient. For in a democracy, then the majority needs some kind of responsiveness to that, or some similar ability. Otherwise, votes just follow emotions, right? As we just saw in the Philippines. The vote in the Philippines that brought back Marcos Jr. to power is based on false information that has denied that his father had killed so many people as a dictator. They managed to whitewash all that through social media. And then the emotional dimension, because he's a giant artist at narratives and all this, led the people in that democracy to vote on the basis of false information. So that's not great.
Another problem is that compared to us, people are so young.
Right.
They haven't actually, they weren't actually there when it was happening. And so I insist on being optimistic about the future. I can't find any good grounds to justify it. I still insist on being positive.
Well, no, we can. There's some ground. The ground is there is more knowledge now about neuroscience and the brain and human nature than ever before in history. And there is also more capacity to think creatively and innovatively about new kind of institutions that are more inclusive, that are more creative, new kind of tools that will bridge over those issues that we have. And there's also a bigger number of people who are aware of those things, and they come together in universities, in international organizations, in things like the Think 20 or around the G20. There is more and more people from around the world who get it, that how serious the situation is for humanity, and we're able to work together. And I've seen working groups together in the Think 20, with all the think tanks of the world, or at the UN, that we would not have had 50 years ago. And there's mutual understanding, and there's also an evolving conscience, especially in the West, especially in Europe, not so much yet in the US. In the US, only in elite universities and the like. But so it's not like there's the whole West ready to fight to death to hold its interest against global South without working together. And there's more and more people who understand we're going to have to work with each other. We're going to have to learn from each other's culture, accept the long traditions and wisdom that many cultures bring. So we have the potential to do it, but we may go through crisis first. Especially US and China, if we have Trump 2024, and Xi Jinping, by the way, is the same. He's also a romantic with narrative of greatness and recovering China dream and all this. So exactly the same, right? Same character. Those narratives of the US refusing to decline and who thinks China has cheated, and China who thinks I was oppressed for 200 years and finally it's my time and no one can stop me anymore. That will come to a clash, and hopefully something like Cuban Missile Crisis, not World War One. Then after that, then we'll be, there will be an interesting period of hope and creativity. Mm-hmm.
Many times in the past, mm-hmm. things have looked hopeless. I imagine in 1937 in Europe, you'd have looked at the vibrant, apparently very successful fascist countries and said, well, look at them. That's the future. And thank God that it didn't happen. Now,
there's reality, right? At some point, reality bites, because the romantic narratives works for 6 months, or can rally the crowds, but then you hit the wall of reality. Your economy falls apart, your army doesn't win as in Russia, something goes wrong, right? And like right now for China is they decided zero COVID, like Omicron has to be dead, and Omicron pops up left and right. So they use harder and harder method. Well, that reality will show. Right? They can't keep doing this more than a few months.
How do you integrate, if you do, the idea of God and divine aid, intervention in all of this? Do you think that figures at all?
Yeah, of course. I spent time thinking about this. But the essence of Christian faith, but you find similar thing in Buddhism and other religion, is that we have a share of us that's divine, that's, we could call it spiritual, that has the ability to grasp the most beautiful, grasp peace, grasp compassion to each other. And then we also have a more violent part, more, we could call it evil in a Christian faith, but in Taoism or in Buddhism, you would call it greed and anxiety and restlessness. So every religion recognizes there is those two things in us, right? And we all feel that. We know it's pretty. And so every religion, and that includes the Christian faith, gives us a pathway on how to enhance or fortify the more spiritual part in us, or to do the good, and to learn to identify and to push back what we call evil, what's aggressive to each other, what's greedy. So we are this mixed, and that corresponds to what we know about human nature from neuroscience. So for me, Christian faith is one pathway toward that. So it includes a piece of self-improvement, but we do it in the name of a God. And it includes a piece of care and love for others, compassion. You find the same two legs in every religion. I read a lot of, Chinese wisdom, Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, you always find those things. You know, there is that work on oneself and then the work of compassion and care for others. One thing to say about religion, though, is religion has led to mistakes too, because they get captured sometimes by human organizations, and then they become organizations, you know, that serve those bad those bad aspects of human nature of certain leaders who captured them, or they become bureaucratic. And we know in Canada that the church condoned and participated and had priests actively doing residential schools, right? And did crimes, you know, like rape and torture and killing of children. And that's horrible. That's the most shocking part for being a Christian at the moment in Canada, is to recon with such thing, right? That the religion is supposed to make you a better person, that you're less likely to do such thing. And then we find the leaders, the priests doing it. And the hope here is the Pope just made a beautiful apology, which was very honest and earnest, in which he said this was a counter-testimony. This is everything against the Christian faith, and this was therefore the highest level crime and sin. And he, you know, he issued a profound apology for it, and he's about to come to Canada to apologize to First Nations. But it still gives us pause, right? That so to be a true religious person is actually very, very difficult. One should not just be lullabied by rituals and by beautiful music and by feeling good like Parisians did or whatever for being in that church. And then not transform one's life toward betterment and care for others. Otherwise, that is not religious, that's counter-religious. But people in church often fall to that bias, right, to that problem. That's the problem of religion, but it goes back to human nature. So I try to keep a very honest attitude. I had a very formative mentor who used to say the first gift of God is intelligence and critical spirit, and then the consciousness, right? So ultimately, when you're doing something that's against God, even though it can be accepted in a church, your conscience will tell you if you listen to it. And ultimately, we're back to mindfulness. That is, mindfulness is about listening to one's profound self. And you can't lie to your own self, right? So you will know if you're doing something that's in the name of religion, like the Pharisees or like those priests or those religious leaders of any religion, doing things that actually are against the spiritual dimension, they can't get away from it. They will know inside. You know? Mm-hmm.
Very good. I would see as well in that the inner source of the inner voice of this is right, this is not right. That's also a source of wisdom. You know, I've been an intellectual my whole life, and I used to try to make choices intellectually, list of pros, and it never worked out really satisfactory until I actually sort of gave up and said, okay, I will, the Christian phrase is leave it on the altar, and but whatever that center, eventually a decision comes and it feels the right decision and it works out much better. So that's that slight addition to
on this, it's known, all kind of writers have written about this, from Plato to you know, the great Buddhist Vietnamese guru who passed away this year, Thich Nhat Hanh, the master. I find the same idea, which is, you know, there's different dimensions in human nature. There is the emotional, intuitive part. There is, you know, there's the intellectual part. There's the appetite, you know, what Plato calls the appetite. And then there is the deeper, the subconscious, or that profound consciousness. And so we have to learn to balance all this. But when we over-intellectualize things, you know, Buddha, for example, kept telling stories. He would come and show a whole bunch of disciples one flower and say nothing for 10 minutes. And everyone is thinking through what does it mean. And in the end, one person smiles, he smiles back and he says, you're the one who got it. You should not over-intellectualize it. You have to enter into a profound relationship with the beauty of that flower. And as you do that, you connect to your deeper subconscious, and you will get insights that will come from that moment. So that's the complexity of human nature. But ultimately to find, and that's where the mindfulness tradition comes in from, whatever, whether it's Stoician or Buddhist or whatever, is to get to that inner profound voice. And it's beyond just intellectual. Eventually we need to turn it into intellectual terms, but one has to listen to the inner voice that's more profound.
I think you can make a connection that I think is justified even with Einstein and his understanding of what he was doing, his coming up with his revolutionary understandings of the world, was that it was coming from that source. It wasn't worked out. Well, he did lots of calculus, of course, but there's a degree of inspiration that comes with all the very best. Is there's inspiration? Inspiration, I think, comes from in breathing of this thing we're talking about, this source.
Right, and one source to get there is nature. Almost all wise people have talked about this. Henry Thoreau, is also a mindfulness leader in that sense. But same with the Buddhists, same with Taoism, same with Jesus going on the mountain or on the lake. Ultimately, in nature, in kind of giving it time, nature will remind us that we're part of it and teach us something about the wholefulness and interconnections. And then as we connect to different parts of nature, we also reconnect ourselves inside. And that's where working for climate, trying to save the planet is so critical, because there's no way for humans to survive happily if we destroy the planet. We are deeply connected.
Well, Yves, we've ranged far and wide.
I'm Ukraine, but it's good to finish on something higher.
It just strikes me as like, what an amazing theatre we're in.
Yeah.
I mean, as you say, there's risk we might be destroying the theatre, but it's an amazing theatre where you go from mindfulness to Ukraine, to international rules, to making an egg sandwich, and going out in nature.
Right.
We're privileged to live in a bizarrely complex, interesting world.